Hello there and welcome back to Sultan Sanctuary. Last time we explored the Festering Banquet and felled the vicious Sada Knight that was at the top. From him, we acquired his ashes as well as the key that will allow us to continue on. But before we do that, we're going to return to our sanctuary. Last time we picked up a stone blacksmith, so we're going to offer that to our sanctuary to summon a blacksmith as well as level up a little more. Much like when we returned previously to offer the stone merchant, we have quite an easy journey back to the sanctuary thanks to the shortcuts. That's actually something that holds true throughout the game. It's generally not too bad to backtrack on foot to previous areas that you've been to. So the blacksmith here can either upgrade your gear, making your weapons and armor stronger, or offer you gear for sale. We'll be making use of that latter service as we don't have the materials necessary to upgrade any of the gear that we're currently using. And honestly, nothing that we're currently using is all that valuable anyway. However, the stuff that we'll be purchasing is quite valuable indeed. We will be picking up a flintlock pistol and a Varangian Spatha, a class 1 flintlock and a class 1 sword, respectively. That flintlock in particular is another reason why joining the Devouras Creed from the beginning is a very good idea, as it is the only creed from whom you can purchase a flintlock pistol immediately. Essentially, the various merchants for each of the creeds offer different selections of gear, usually a standard set of items and then something extra. You can purchase flintlock pistols from the blacksmiths of other creeds, but doing that requires you to level up in that creed, which is something we'll be going into a fair bit later. Suffice it to say, if you want a flintlock pistol as early as possible, join Devouras Light Creed, that's the only way. And make sure to purchase flintlock rounds from your local merchant as well. Can't have you firing blanks after all. Of course, Amelia is not currently skilled in the use of firearms or swords, so let's change that by getting a few more levels, acquiring a few more black pearls, and progressing along the tree of skill a little bit more. Something that's worth noting is that nodes that give you stat proficiencies also give you stat points equal to the level of that proficiency, so for example, level 1 marksman also gives you 1 point of dexterity, which most ranged weapons scale with. Because of that, it's better to aim for weapon or armor proficiencies as opposed to pure stat gains, as that way you gain the ability to wield more gear and stat gains. Anyway, Amelia now has the ability to wield the Varangian Spatha and the flintlock pistol that we purchased, so let's get those equipped. Thinking about the choice of gear, Amelia has basically gone from Devout Cleric to Shifty Thief to Pirate really, in very short order. Just an interesting thing to note. Also, I'm really not sure why the game skipped there like that. I'm not sure how noticeable that actually was with my commentary over it, but it was very noticeable when playing. I've noticed that happens on occasion with this game. I have no idea if it's an issue with the game itself or my computer. Probably a little bit of both. At the very least, it doesn't crop up for the rest of the episode, so rest assured. So let's actually get to making some progress here. As I mentioned at the beginning, we picked up a key from the Sada Knight, and that lets us get beyond the Festering Banquet. And encounter this man. This here is the Wandering Knight, and if you've played Dark Souls or Dark Souls 3, he's basically the equivalent in those games to Siegmeyer or Siegward. And we can just kind of cockblock him by saying that we're not interested in his quest, which results in an amusing bit of dialogue from him. But that doesn't really help us on our way, so let's humor him. By doing this, he tells us of his own goal to invade a castle to the east and slay its dragon, as those are things a knight is wont to do. After that, he gives us a series of very useful hints that are very much worth noting if you're playing the game yourself, telling us of a passage below the Festering Banquet to a village of sorts, as well as a jester who knows of a way to reach places that no one else can. Those are pretty much the only instructions that the game actually ever gives you, so remember his words. Right there we picked up the Pauper's starting set, at least most of it, the clothes and one of the weapons that the Pauper starts with. We won't be using it because, while it is one of the better starting weapons, it's overall a fair bit weaker than the Varangian Spatha. Here I'm just shuffling around the gear a little bit. I want to make sure to maintain below 50% equip load. Essentially, the equip load tiers in this game are 0 to 25, 25 to 50, 50 to 75, 75 to 100, and then over 100, with the movement speed and roll getting worse with each successive tier. Staying under 50 is ideal for most characters. So here we come across another sanctuary, but one that's already been claimed by a cleric of our own creed, Devourer's Light. Naturally, we are welcomed here and able to utilize all of these services that were available at the sanctuary that we established ourselves. This cleric being here, by the way, is why I didn't bother to offer the cleric statue that we picked up at our first sanctuary. No point when there's one right here. The cleric, much like the blacksmith, acts as an alternative merchant, offering her own set of wares, as well as the sale of prayers. We will be picking up the helmet to complete our starting armor set, but none of the prayers that she offers. We have neither the gold nor the esoteric knowledge necessary to use them, by which I mean prayers class 2. Here I am again, fiddling with the armor configuration to maintain below 50% equip load at all times, while maintaining good fashion, of course. So here we pick up a stone sellsword, which we're going to offer here because it is completely useless to us. I just want to show off what it does. The stone sellsword is how you access this game's co-op feature, which unfortunately is local only. Essentially, they have to have their own character on a save file on the system that you're playing on, as well as a separate controller in order to activate at the stone sellsword. If you're playing with another person, you can also initiate a PvP match with them with that Egg of Wrath that the stone sellsword is offering. But yeah, otherwise this game doesn't really have synchronous co-op or anything like that, which is a bit of a disappointment. The developers have expressed interest in possibly adding that at some point, but considering that the game is close to being a year old at this point and they've not said another word on the matter, my thinking is that that's probably not going to happen. So all that aside, let's head onwards into the Bandit's Pass. Now, this area is actually markedly more difficult than the other area that we're going to visit in this episode. And this little corpse pile here is a big reason why. A ton of enemies spawn here, more than you would necessarily think of, although it is appropriate given that there's a huge pile of bodies here. So if you venture a bit too far, you'll end up getting surrounded on both sides and pretty much just ganked to death. And if you try and flee forwards, you'll encounter even more difficult resistance with a tougher Marauder enemy to face. If you keep your calm, it's not too difficult, and the flintlock pistol especially really helps with these guys. It doesn't have quite the range of the other ranged weapon options, but it packs way more punch than them. I wouldn't say this goes perfectly by any means, getting munched on by this dog here being a good example of that. But we do survive, and that's what's important. Fighting these guys in close combat can be a huge pain in the ass because they are incredibly tanky. They can just resist through most of your attacks. Here I'm making use of the flintlock's high damage output to send them into such low health that they immediately collapse and allow me to go for a critical finishing move. But if you don't do that, they will just swing right through most weapon strikes that you try, and then proceed to just spam you to death with their own quick attack combos. Oh, and as you likely noticed, they also have a ranged attack that tracks to a ridiculous degree. If you don't dodge at just the right time, you will get hit by that attack as you're fleeing and likely finished off. Basically what I'm saying is, don't think they're easy just because I made them look like they were. So, descending down here into the darkness, we come across another feature of the game, traps. In various areas you'll find traps set by the enemies, tripwires triggering crossbows and other nefarious devices. It's important to keep out an eye for these because they can be quite damaging. The crossbows, not so much, but other traps, they can potentially one-shot you. So this area here is dark enough that we have to take out one of our torches. The torch in this game has a dedicated button holding down on the D-pad, as you can see in the bottom left there. That also shows how many torches we have and how much light we have on our current torch. So this way is not going to be making us any progress, but we have picked up quite a few items, namely a few pieces of heavy armor, the Raiders set, and I called them Marauders earlier, but that was a bit of a mistake, as well as a few pieces of the chain set. If you want some pretty decent early game heavy armor, this is the place to go. Although, contrarily, going here with a heavy build is actually a pretty bad idea. You want a fast roll to deal with the Raiders. But yeah, as I just said, we're not going to be making any progress here because the bridge to the castle to the east is very much out. And all we have left is a stone obelisk, which unfortunately we can't currently interact with, but thankfully the old man does give us a little bit of advice, telling us to go back to the start, which for us would be the Festering Banquet. And if you recall, the Wandering Swordsman told us that, hey, there may be a path to some sort of village underneath the Festering Banquet. But before we get to doing that, we have a little bit of a secret here that I accidentally showed off earlier. The developers are very much willing to hide platforms behind bits of object in the foreground. This one here is probably meant to act as a soft tutorial on this mechanic, but in my opinion it doesn't work out all that well, because there's nothing overtly hinting that there's a hidden platform that you can jump onto. If anything, knowing this genre of game, you'd be more likely to think that you would need to acquire some sort of double jump in order to get up there. But either way, we did find the secret and acquired a stone guide for it. Stone guides are particularly valuable, so I won't be placing one here. We'll see what it does in a little while. For now, we're going to level up a few more times and pick up another node on the Tree of Skill. This one for a poultice pouch. This gives us one replenishable potion whenever we rest at a sanctuary. We also pick up the ability to use Class 1 heavy armor so we can actually equip the heavy gear that we picked up. This will naturally make us quite a bit slower, but that's fine in the area that we're going to, and the extra defense will help us tank any hits that we do receive. Yeah, the roll is much worse than it was before. But again, defense does actually do a lot to mitigate damage in this, so it's a worthy trade-off. We're also going to try out our first halberd. You'll notice that it has a single red line crossing it out as opposed to the two that were there when we didn't have the ability to use the flintlock pistol or the sword. What that means is we can two-hand the weapon but not one-hand it. To one-hand a Class 1 halberd, we would need the ability to two-hand Class 2 halberds, and so on and so forth along the line. So here we have another interesting mechanic, hidden walls that can be opened up by pressing the back button, circle on the PlayStation controller, letting you access secret areas. This one is not particularly useful as it just leads to the other side of a shortcut that we won't be opening up for a very long time. But this is a secret mechanic that I like a lot more than the hidden platforms one. For one, it actually shows up a lot more often throughout the game in fact, whereas the hidden platforms only show up early on. For another, even though they never tell you about it, I think they set up situations for you to find out about that mechanic on your own a little bit better. Mainly because the button used to open up the walls is also the same button used to collect item drops from enemies. So if an enemy dies near where a secret wall is and drops an item there, you'll likely end up opening up the wall trying to pick up the item. Same if a player leaves a message there, even if it's one not pointing out the secret wall. And at this point, there are enough player messages pointing out the secret walls that you don't really have to just mash the button against every wall you come across anymore. But that's enough talking about that, so let's get to discussing some of the things that have been happening that I haven't been talking about. We opened up another shortcut leading back to the Festering Banquet. We picked up our first bow, and I'll be showing off that in a little bit. And we came across another merchant, this one operating outside of our sanctuary system. He'll be showing up in a few spots in the game, and he is a quite important merchant indeed, as he sells some very unique items. He is one of the few merchants in the game to actually sell upgrade materials for your weapons. as well as various boss armor sets, in this case the Sodden Knight set. His prices are quite high, so we're not going to purchase anything just yet, but it's very much worth keeping him in mind. Beyond him, we have yet another shortcut that we can't open from this side. There's a reason I told you to get used to them last time. There are a lot of them in this game. So here's where we're going to be trying out the bow, and then summarily putting it down. Bows in this game aren't bad, but they're not good either. To equip them, you require both hands, so you can't wield any other weapons with them, although the trade-off is that you get 2 ammunition types to use at once with square and triangle. The damage currently is okay, but it doesn't really scale up all that well the farther you go into the game. It's mainly there to provide a source of long-range damage as opposed to the gun's more medium range, but even then it ends up being beaten out by the crossbow, which does similar damage with a similar range and can be equipped in one hand, and thus can be used with an actual weapon. So yeah, bows aren't all that great, and we're not going to be using them from here on out. But over here we encounter what is probably the most important secret area if you're playing as a mage, because here you get to pick up a spell that is a huge upgrade in terms of damage to the starting Fireball spell, and if you don't start out as a mage, it is the quickest way that you can acquire spells to use. Now, to fully explore this secret area, we're going to have to delve into the darkness here, and I would highly recommend that you do this on a character who can actually roll worth a damn, i.e. not a character weighed down with heavy armor, because that character is not going to fare too well against this guy here. This is a Chitinmite or something like that, Armormite, I don't remember the exact name, but it doesn't really matter. He is a much later game enemy that they throw at you really early on to guard the items that lie beyond. And if you try and tank through him, you are going to die very quickly because the armor that is available this early on does not provide enough damage mitigation for that to be a feasible strategy. You have to roll through his attacks. Thankfully, if you can do that, he's pretty easy to take out, especially if you have a bomb type item. If you paid attention to the admittedly tiny damage numbers, you'll notice that the Blessed Urns we were using were doing like 10 times the damage of our weapon swings. But yeah, as a reward we pick up a Stained Page, which is a useful buff item, good for non-mages, as well as a Stone Mage, an essential item for any burgeoning magic user. The mage that you can summon to your sanctuary with it sells a very good selection of offensive spells, albeit at a high gold cost, so you better save up if you want to actually purchase any, but it's pretty much the only way to get spells early on other than that one lightning spell pickup. So, secrets aside, let's get back to making a little bit of progress here. After we deal with these annoying sons of bitches that we call bats. Ugh, seriously, I hate these enemies so much. If you don't have a weapon with wide horizontal coverage, they are a huge pain in the butt to actually hit. And they just fly around and fly through walls and harass you, but thankfully they are immediately followed by something very useful and incredibly handy shortcut right back to our initial sanctuary. And we're going to immediately offer a stone idol, not the mage. We're going to be getting into Magicka a little bit later. Instead, we'll be offering the stone guide. What stone guides allow you to do is visit any other sanctuary that you've been to in the game. Additionally, you can fast travel to any sanctuary that has had a guide placed at it using the Calling Horn item, of which we have 3 picked up along with that stone guide. Essentially what the game lets you do is set up your own fast travel network that allows you to even more easily get around the various areas in the game, which I gotta say is pretty gosh darn cool. I love it when games actually let you set up your own fast travel network rather than using a predetermined one by the game. Sadly, not enough games do this. Kingsfield, Dragon's Dogma, and now this are the only examples I can think of off the top of my head. But my personal and quite possibly poor opinions aside, we have another secret to uncover here, one that is incredibly valuable to any character that you may be building. From this chest we acquire the Kismet Stone, which is one of the 2 rings in the game that allows you to boost your drop rate of items. Needless to say, this item is absolutely invaluable if you want to farm up something rare. I mentioned that these secret walls are something that's present throughout the game, but really thinking about it, they're heavily front-loaded. A lot of the best secrets are early on, but that's enough about that as we enter the Village of Smiles. Oh, that is such a happy sounding name. I'm sure this place is gonna be great. The fact that there's a trap immediately at the start supports that. Because, and I mean that legitimately, we're going to use that trap to our advantage here by killing the first wolf so it doesn't run into it in advance and avoid it entirely, and then dragging this knight over, we can kill the other wolf and send the knight into such low health that we can just stomp on him and take him out immediately. It's worth mentioning that this knight, the Bronze Knight, does not actually respawn. He's something of a Black Knight equivalent if you're coming from Dark Souls, and is appropriately tough for that title. If you don't use the trap to take him out, you pretty much have to rely on parries if you want to do any significant amount of damage. Thankfully, the rest of the enemies in this area are pretty standard fare and are pretty quickly taken out by a combination of flintlock and halberd. We can't use them at the same time, but we can pretty quickly switch between them by switching our loadouts. Now, we could head along this ground path and rush into the dogs directly, but let's try this upper path instead, and see if we can't find a better vantage point from which to take them on. Of course, in doing so, we'll have to deal with additional enemies, but that's fine as long as we don't rush ahead too quickly and let ourselves get swamped. It also nets us another item, a pretty decent shield. It's not good at blocking physical damage, but it blocks 100% of poison damage. So, heading along this upper path, we spook the dogs. If we hadn't gotten rid of that crossbow trap there, the one running to the left would have triggered it and died, but he's also run far enough away that we don't have to deal with him, so it doesn't really matter. Heading further to the right here, we come across an area that requires a fair bit of platforming. Platforming which can be quite risky because if we were to fall here, we would likely die. It's actually a fairly interesting setup because it's not just a bottomless pit. If we were to fall here, we would actually fall into another area that is located directly below us. And if you actually fall at the start of this platforming section, you'll fall just shallowly enough that you'll actually survive, at least if you're at full HP, whereas if you fall later on in this section, you'll almost certainly die, no matter how much health you have. Fortunately, we don't find out about that personally, and we pick up a very useful ring, one that increases our equip load, allowing us to equip a bit more gear while still maintaining a decent roll and movement speed. Heading further on, we encounter a few other items that are actually pretty dangerously guarded, which is why I paused there, making sure I was pretty well equipped to handle it. These enemies here are the Saltless. They are a much later game enemy that are incredibly deadly. They have a grab that does around half of your health and a much more dangerous move, where they lob a potion at you that absolutely shreds any defenses you have, greatly increasing the damage that you take. Their aim is also ridiculously good and their projectiles track a ridiculous degree, which means you will very quickly die if you just try and fight these guys on their own terms, which is why I did not allow that at all. Instead, I made use of a very handy mechanic that the game never actually explains: weapon combos. You've seen me before do launches by doing a light and then a heavy attack. That is one example of a weapon combo that is present among most of the weapon classes in the game. The straight swords in particular have some especially good weapon combos. The one I used there was light, light, and up light to do a jumping attack at the end. That knocks down enemies and made the Saltless really easy to deal with. Sadly, weapon combos aren't going to come in too handy versus the Bronze Knights because they can't really be stunned by anything. Instead, it's the good old parry game, which can be done with both shields, two-handed weapons, and, believe it or not, ranged weapons. Guns, bows, and crossbows can all parry enemies if you shoot them right as they attack, as I attempt to show off here, and unfortunately repeatedly fail. The timing is a lot trickier than the shield or weapon parry. Instead, I end up damaging him enough to make him collapse and do that finisher instead. Which, hey, we survived, it works out. It's okay in my book. That Bronze Knight, much like the previous one, does not respawn, and he drops a unique reward, the Conduit of the Mind. What this does is lock our focus bar to 1/3 of our total stamina. Simply put, it increases the amount of focus bar that we have to play with, which currently isn't too useful, which is why we're not using the ring. The only actions that consume and rely on focus in order to be performed are spellcasting, using prayers or magic, and we're not currently relying on that, so it's not a useful ring. So this here is the Watching Woods. Right now we're directly below where we did that little bit of platforming a bit ago. We're not going to go any further into this area, that's for later. I just wanted to show off this enemy springing this trap and getting himself clobbered to death. You could say that it pleases me. Instead, we're going to head back into the Village of Smiles and explore it a little bit more. Here is something of a secret, a little passageway into the wall that you can find if you're paying enough attention. And in it is a real shitfucker of a weapon, the Claymore. Yeah, the name is pretty much just a transliteration of how the Japanese would pronounce the word Claymore. Kuremore. So yeah, this thing is a greatsword class weapon, and that means currently we can only two-hand it. If we wanted to one-hand it, we would need to become proficient with Class 2 swords, which would give us the ability to one-hand Class 1 greatswords. It's a similar situation to what we had with the halberd. Appropriate then that we're replacing the halberd with the claymore. I'll be discussing overall weapon balance in the game a bit later, but suffice it to say that slow heavy weapons in this game are far and ahead, much stronger comparatively than the shorter, faster hitting weapons. But that's enough about that. So here we come across a sanctuary that has been claimed by another creed. We still have the ability to level up and progress along the tree of skill as we please, but we can no longer make offerings as we're not a part of the creed. We could take the oath, but it would make us an apostate to the Devourer's Light creed, and that's something that's best avoided. Something else that's worth noting is that resting at a sanctuary commanded by another creed gives you that creed's healing item, in this case the Red Flask. The Red Flask is actually slightly less useful than the Water of Blessing, and that's because even though it heals for the same amount, it doesn't provide that brief defense boost, which can be really handy if you're fighting a dangerous opponent. So I mentioned before that the same merchants of different creeds will actually offer different items for sale. For example, our blacksmith, the Devourer's Light blacksmith, offered a flintlock for sale, and this one does not. On the other hand, this blacksmith offers what is probably one of the best shields in the game, and certainly the best medium shield, the Toothless Shield. It offers 100% protection from both physical damage types, slashing and bludgeoning, as well as a high amount of stability, which governs how much stamina damage you take when blocking attacks. In addition to that purchase, we'll be upgrading the Claymore here, just to show off just how much of a shitfucker it can be, how quickly it can take out enemies. Oh, and since I never explicitly mentioned it, this creed here is called the Creed of the Three. So we picked up some blacksmith armor as soon as we entered this sanctuary, so let's check that stuff out. It's light armor, so it doesn't provide too much in the way of defense for most damage types, but it provides excellent fire defense, definitely a set worth equipping if you're fighting enemies that utilize fire. Doesn't have a helmet though, so let's finish it off with this jack-o'-lantern head, one of the items we picked up from the area with the Saltless. And by tinkering with our gear, we now have a low enough equip load that we actually have a pretty decent roll again. So let's get back to exploring more of this wonderfully happy village, and utilizing traps to our advantage. You'll notice that we're actually making backwards progress now, coming back around to an area where we were previously. Only now there's this scarecrow person here. What creature persists in the face of such suffocating despair? The others have begun to kneel. Will it join them? How about no? Such a brave, foolish curiosity. It will struggle then, and it will bleed, and it will fall, and one day when it finds itself beaten and broken, gasping for air, choking on its own blood and tears, that will be the day that it kneels, and I will consume it. So yeah, this guy here is definitely one of the more interesting NPCs that we'll be coming across. Naturally, we won't be getting any answers as to what all that conversation was about for quite some time, so let's just ignore it for now, and continue to use traps in amusing fashion. Thank you, iframes. And this next bit here is a little bit hectic. Thanks to these bats and all these enemies spawning up, I tried to show off clearly that that enemy that wanders off ends up triggering a trap of his own volition and ends up killing himself. But that probably wasn't the clearest thing in the world again due to all that chaos. I do show off again how useful the sword's combos are. Being able to do a lot of damage while also knocking back enemies is incredibly useful in this. But like I said before, it's not really effective against the Bronze Knight, so instead we try for the parry game again, which hey, I get the first gunshot to do so. Unfortunately, my follow-up is not nearly so, shall we say, skilled. I try and be cool and go for a weapon parry, but it doesn't really work out. Thankfully, the shit-fucking ability of the Claymore pretty much saves me here. And we acquire another ring as well as an incredibly lucky drop. The Bronze Knight are wearing the Kraken armor set, and the only way you can get it is from a random drop. Thanks, Kismet Stone. Sadly, we can't use it just yet because it is Class 3 heavy armor, but you can bet your dollar that we'll be wearing it eventually when we actually get to that point. Coming out over here, we actually come across our final secret for this video. One last persnickety secret wall, this one only told to you by the fact that if you come from the other side, you can clearly see this item that has no apparent way of access. And if you know about secret walls, you can find it easily enough. And find it is something you very much want to do, as it's one of the better rings in the game, especially if you're burdening yourself with a lot of gear, as it increases the speed of your roll. Now, if you're in the 50 or below tier, or especially the 25 or below tier, this isn't too useful of an item because the roll animation is already plenty fast. But if you're fat and burdened with gear and you have that crappy roll animation, it can be a lifesaver because the roll itself actually has plenty of iframes, it's just that it's really slow. So the wrapped link pretty much makes the fat roll roughly equivalent to the medium roll, which is pretty great. But enough about that, because at long last we come to the boss of this level, who we cannot quite see but is indicated by this candelabra here. And we're going to make a bit of a gear change for this, swapping out our flintlock for the good old Toothless Shield. Say hello to Lene, the Queen of Smiles. Oh, she's such a jolly lady. Jolly for murder. So I mentioned while fighting the Sodden Knight that if you have a good shield, you can just completely cheese a lot of boss fights, especially those early on in the game. And this is a perfectly good example of that. The Queen of Smiles can't do jack shit to us if we have the Toothless Shield up. Her attacks do no damage thanks to its 100% physical protection, and they don't do all that much stamina damage as well, so as long as you maintain your stamina fairly high, you never have to worry about anything, and you can finish this fight while taking no damage with ease. I do show off rolling through some of her attacks just to show off that that's viable as well, but it's something you more have to actively do and think about, whereas the Toothless Shield just plunk that thing up, and the fight's mostly taken care of for you. And it's just a matter of getting hits in after her attack strings. She's not a difficult boss by any means. Although she does get a few good licks in here at the end, mostly due to me mistiming some of my attacks and being a bit more aggressive than I should have been, but it still works out pretty handily. Something else worth noting that you may have noticed in the fight is that we buffed our weapon with the Blessed Pages that we got, and that's because she's weak to the holy damage that it provides. And more noticeably that when we switched between our loadouts, the buff stayed on our weapon, it switched from the Claymore to the Varangian Spatha, a handy feature of convenience that this game allows. Also, her name is technically Linnea, not Linnae. I got it slightly wrong, I'm sorry. I'm not actually sorry, I barely give a shit about the lore in this game. So yeah, that's Linnea, the Queen of Smiles, whose ear we now have acquired. Pleasant. Continuing on, we come across a chest that has the chef starting set, as well as the chef starting weapon, the iron pot, which means that a chef managed to make it past the Queen of Smiles, further demeaning her. And then apparently the chef stripped naked and then put their gear in the chest for some reason. I really didn't think this train of thought through, did I? Never mind. We have a door to open here leading to the outside. There's not really much in the way of progress to be had here, but we do pick up an incredibly useful item and one that we've not had before, a charm. Charms can be equipped in the tertiary loadout slot, where ammo would be if you had a crossbow or gun in the secondary slot, and they provide pure buffs to the weapons in that loadout. In the case of the Bloodflower charm, it provides a small percentage-based boost to attack, which is dependent on the base attack of the weapon. So our Claymore gets a bit of a bigger boost than our Varangian Spatha. The downside of charms is that they are mutually exclusive with one-handed ranged weapons, as they take up the third slot, which is used by the ammo for those weapons, so technically you could have one of those equipped, but you just wouldn't be able to fire it because you would not have your ammunition equipped. And one last thing to bring up here, you can also acquire black pearls as specific placements in the world, usually after a boss fight. We actually picked one up right outside of the Festering Banquet, if you recall, near the Wandering Knight. But that's the Village of Smiles down, so see you next time when we venture into the Watching Woods.